Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm in a place where there's a little bit of ambient sound, so I'm only going to do a portion of this lecture with a video because there's a quieter space that I can record in, but the light's not as good. So today I'm really going to focus pretty specifically on the United States. This is something that is not covered in your text, and so this week we're going to kind of deviate just slightly because there's a lot of really important things that happen in the United States that happened before 1944, which is, of course, at the end of the Second World War, which is about 30 years ahead of any artwork that I've shown you to date. And it's just it's very important that you have this understanding. Now, that's one major reason why I want to include this lecture and this topic and these artists in our course. The second is that a lot of the people that I'm going to be showing you have very deep connections to Maine. It might sound kind of surprising, but when it comes to 20th century art, Maine has actually been a really pivotal point. And it has been such a pivotal point for the very same reason that we have vacation land on our license plates and that we have Acadia National Park. Wealthy people from New York City have been vacationing in Maine for as long as, for about 150 years, pretty much, right? And with these, wealthy leaders of industry or newspaper barons or however they made their money, with these people come other sets of vacationing / relaxing people, including artists. A lot of these artists also come from money, and so they're kind of inhabiting these same circles. They're going to the same parties, they're invited to the same estates, they're very well to do. That's the story of early American art. Not to say that all these people are like insanely rich people. I'm not talking to you about painters that are also the Astor family or oil barons or steel barons is actually what they were primarily wealthy for. These were people whose family had money, and so like other destination spots, when the super wealthy go there, they're often followed by people that have means but are not necessarily as well-to-do as, say, the richest 1%, right? Someplace like the Hamptons off New York, or that was originally inhabited by. I'm getting totally off topic, and I'm going to stop talking about it. But anyway, so yes, one, these guys are really important. Two, there's a connection to Maine. Three, the reason I'm highlighting this connection to Maine, it has to do with your paper. Part of that paper assignment is going to see works of art that are actually on view. If you go to the Portland Museum of Art, which I recommend doing, it's a wonderful establishment. I also recommend doing it on First Friday because that's when it's free and open to the public. So you'll see a lot of these guys' names in those galleries. So it's just kind of cool. And also, if you go to, say, the Bowdoin Museum, for those of you who might be located in the Mid-Coast area, there are also lots of these people on public display. So with that, we are going to begin speaking about American modernism. The first slide that I'm starting off with here, and you can see that there's no identifier, so obviously this is not going to be on any kind of exam, but this is a painting by an artist who we're going to deal with in just a few slides. His name is sorry, little technical hiccup. This is a painting by an American artist named Childe Hassam. I'm going to be showing you one of his paintings in just a few slides. This one is not one that you need to necessarily know. It comes much later. But the reason why I'm starting off showing you this slide is that this painting by Mr. Hassam hangs in the Oval Office. And for those of you who have ever seen images of the Oval Office. When you see the president sitting at his desk, to his right, hanging on the nearby wall, is a very slender painting that's not actually very large. It's this painting. And this is a very common theme for Mr. Hassam. He made a career for himself making paintings about parade routes. He was very much into the idea of celebration, specifically the celebration of national pride. And so he is a fitting inclusion in the White House because it's a showcasing of national pride, but he's also a fitting introduction to our lecture because you can see the way that this painting is handled, the way the paint is actually put on the canvas, is a very impressionist mode. And so we are kind of going back aesthetically. You know, we got pretty far with Cubism, we got pretty far with Futurism, we got a little farther than this with Fauvism, but there's a very, very good reason for all of that, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, is actually something that's referred to as the spread of the avant-garde. So, with that, let's get things going. Starting off around the time that our course started is this painting. From 1875, we have Thomas Eakins' The Gross Clinic. Now, this is a work of art that is also very instrumental in the telling of American history. This is a pivotal moment, or it's a pivotal situation, is probably the easiest way to say it. It's a very important idea that we have here. This is a surgeon who is at a teaching hospital in Philadelphia, and he is here instructing all of these young doctors that are sitting in the amphitheater about what is going on with this patient. And here it's actually, I believe it's a young boy who has, I'm totally blanking on what the affliction in this young boy's leg is, but it's a young boy's leg. And they are operating on this young boy's leg, and voila, here we have this painting of this image. Why am I starting off with this image? Because I wanted to, if we're talking about painting in a different country, it's good to start the timeline off around the same time. So, you know, our first lecture began much earlier, around 1817, but the important works that we were talking about for this course, and I say important because those are the ones that are going to be the ones that I focus on from the exam forward, come out of around 1871 with the Impressionist first show, although 1863, Olympia, I've shown you that painting quite a lot. That's a very important painting. That painting will be on the exam in some fashion, so know all that you can about that painting, both what I say about it and what Gompert says about it. So, if 1871 was this breakout year for the Impressionists, 1875 is the completion of what is regarded as a modern American masterpiece. You can see the way that the paint's handled here. There are some elements of this new painting style, a la Courbet or Manet, or even Delacroix, where there are elements that are not very finished or very polished. You know, you can see the gentlemen who are sitting in the back of the stadium, they're just rendered very loosely and very quickly. But that said, there is an intention to a realistic use of space. There's an intention to a correct mathematical deduction of how this amphitheater is actually constructed. You know, Eakins was in this space. He made lots and lots of preparatory sketches in this space. And so he is someone who is akin to the academics, the people who are working for the École des Beaux-Arts, who you all just turned in last week, those papers. You know, he is the art academy, and he is regarded as that art academy. And so, like French art of the same time period, the story of American modernism starts actually in the academy. And so here we have an academic American painting. So if we have this very standard format for how the academy works, you have the neoclassical, which is the person who does like a million preparatory sketches, does this perfect perspectival measuring, renders everything crisply. I'm thinking specifically of Jean-Auguste Dominique Ing, right? On the other side, you have the more brushy, the romantic, and in that category, on the French side of the ocean, we have Delacroix. In the United States, we have Akins, who represents the Academy, and actually, like the French Academy and the British Academy, the French Academy is the École des Beaux-Arts, the British Academy is referred to as the Royal Academy. Akins taught at the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, and so that academy actually still exists. I think it might actually be called the Pennsylvania Academy College of Art, because it's PACA. I can't remember what that C stands for right now. Sorry. So that's one side of the academy. The other side would be represented by this gentleman, William Merritt Chase. Now, William Merritt Chase was not necessarily an academician in the same way that Delacroix was. He did teach painting, he did do that, but he wasn't, it was still a little bit of a different system. I mean, the French Academy was established in the 1500s. American academies obviously couldn't be founded in the 1500s because there were so few Europeans here, and the indigenous peoples didn't have a painting culture. So in order for a painting culture to actually be founded in the United States, we have to wait for the Europeans to come over. So they come over, they colonize, they do that thing that all of you know they do, and then 150 years later, in and around the 1780s, 1790s, we see the first American art schools opening. But they're still small. And so it's the equivalent of, say, New York University, which is a massive art program, to the Maine College of Art, which only has about 400 students. So that's the equivalent. The French Academy is huge, hundreds of students, hundreds of painters, hundreds of sculptors. The American schools, only a few students, only a few professors, very, very small. Chase worked in one of these smaller schools. He worked in New York, and he maintained a studio in New York. And so he rendered this painting of the interior of his studio, which was on 10th Street in Manhattan, and this was made in 1880. Now, the thing I want to point out with this work, and I'm purposely belaboring these initial steps in American modernism. The thing I want to point out with this work is its similarity, but also it's almost entirely different from the kinds of inner world views of artistic practice that we've had from the European camp. Van Gogh, around the same time, didn't render an artist's studio, he rendered his bedroom. Because in Europe, painters were already dealing with personal expression. Personal expression was the thing that really made their career in Europe. In the United States, these people were still tethered to their patrons. It was very much still one-to-one. Someone had to request a painting to be completed in order for the artist to actually work on it. In Paris, people were making works for a marketplace that existed outside of the studio. So the artists actually had a little bit of control over their practice. That's why Van Gogh, Gauguin, Seurat were able to develop these kind of quirky, new fashions of making paintings. In the United States, however, things still operated on that older system. And so when looking at this painting by Chase, you can see here this woman in white who's sitting in a large blue chair in the center of the frame, and off to the painting's left-hand side, which is on your right-hand side, you can see the artist actually making preparatory sketches of his sitter. He's doing this because this woman has come into his studio and he is making sketches so that when she leaves, he can complete a painting for her on consignment, on commission. Now, the interesting thing here is this isn't just showcasing Chase's, this isn't like a business card where it's like, oh look, my name is William Merritt Chase and I make paintings. Here's a painting I made. Instead, he's giving you he's giving you this full view of the inside of his studio space. And inside of that studio space is a collection of very important things to him and to the way that he presents himself as a painter. In the same way that Picasso would come in 25 years to flaunt his influence of sub-Saharan African masks, in the same way that Gauguin in just 9 years will use the native indigenous traditions of Tahiti to influence his paintings, Chase was very interested in presenting a very worldly view to his patrons. He wasn't just someone who made paintings of people, of well-to-do people. In fact, what he was interested in as a painter was this larger aura of a painter. What does it mean to be a painter? It means that you have to be worldly. And given where New York was and where the rest of the world was, on the other side of the Atlantic, it was hard to do that. So even people who were well-to-do didn't often traverse that Atlantic Ocean. But Chase had the opportunity to do that. A few other American painters also had the opportunity to do that. And when they would go over, they would bring things back. And they would decorate their studios with these things from their travels. So things like an oriental rug is a very important thing to have in the studio because it shows that he has been to that part of the world and he has brought things back. And he has not just brought back the carpet, he has also brought back the aesthetics. So he's seen these things, he's schooled in these things, but not just schooled in this very academic way, he's schooled in this very worldly way. So think about the German expressionist Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, whose self-portrait I showed you last week. He had this, he had a cigar, he had his monocle, and he was this king. That's how he presented himself, with that weird curtain hanging in the back that looked like a crown, right? He was presenting himself as an intellectual, someone who was savvy in the world. Chase is a collector of things. On that same note, think of the painting that I showed you, also of a German expressionist origin, of the Indian and woman. That kind of interior space, when I talked about how the Indian represented Eastern faith, the mirror represented another perspective on yourself, and then he had a non-Western model be the woman in that painting. That was all relative to this motif of the painter being the collector of worldly things, and then they put them all in this little box, and then or a painting in this case, and they give them to the person who's purchasing it. Today we refer to this whole penchant as curating. That's a huge loaded word, but if anyone ever asks you what a curator is, that's what they do. They collect things, but very specific things that tell a very specific story about who they are. And so as we go through American modernism over the next, hopefully 45 minutes, what you're going to be seeing is the way that people that are not immediately in the epicenter of these conversations around, Van Gogh was cutting edge painting, Gauguin cutting edge painting, all the way back to the Impressionists. They were breaking new ground in painting. In America, there was a delay, and that delay was quite literally the physical distance from the boat. You got on a boat in New York and you took that boat over to London, and then you had to take another boat to Paris. It's like a 6-month trip when you do the whole thing, and given the amount of time that you want to spend in those places. I mean, it wasn't a 6-month sea voyage because that was like Columbus stuff. We had faster boats then. So here we go. So starting off, we had those two polar representations. We had Eakins with American neoclassicism, or that's what I'm referring to it as. That's not a term you need to necessarily write down, but he represents that penchant in American culture. Then you have Chase, who represents the more romantic side of things. Now in France, out of those two things, the first thing that came up was realism, right? We had Courbet, and then we had, right after him, we had Manet, and then after him we had the Impressionists. In the United States, it was Akins, Chase. There's a guy named John Singer Sargent, who I'm not going to talk about, but he's a painter who's around. You'll see his work if you go to any major museum. Boston has a bunch of his stuff because he lived in Boston and worked in Boston quite regularly. And then immediately you have this guy, and this is the same guy who started off our lecture, Childe Hassam. Here you have late afternoon, New York winter, 1900. Now this work bears a striking similarity to this work by Camille Pissarro. Camille Pissarro's work is from 1897. This work is actually referred to as a later Impressionist work when you think about it in relationship to the French system. Because remember, Impressionism blew the doors out in 1871. So fast forward 26 years, at 16 years, 26 years. There's a reason I teach art and I don't teach math. So fast forward that time, and you get a painter who's making the same kinds of canvases that he was producing in almost 30 years prior, right? But in the United States, that's different, because those 30 years were an entire ocean apart. And with works like this coming from 1880, I mean, this work, if this was produced in France, chances are paintings produced in France that look like this came from, drum roll, you guys probably, hopefully some of you are going to guess, that it came from around the 1860s, if not a little bit before then. This is Delacroix's region. This is his territory. So think of the Raft of the Medusa. Think of, there's lots of things you can think of. There's lots of paintings. But, so there's that delay. And again, the delay. Childe Hassam is referred to as an American Impressionist. He's one of hundreds of American Impressionists. There are still today people who make work in the United States and in France, but more in the United States, that looks like this and that operates in the same visual vocabulary. This course is really designed to show you the way that painting progresses, and that progress denotes a straight line that we're going to follow, right? So, you know, take that for what it is. I'm not too excited when I see a new painting that looks like this, because, come on, it's 100 years old. But, you know, painting, it's cool, I like it. Anyway, Childe Hassam, late afternoon, New York, winter. So what we have, the similarities between Pissarro's Boulevard Montmartre morning, cloudy weather, well, there's a lot of similarities. Urban street, urban street. A title denoting the actual weather, morning. So we have a time period, give my finger, a time period, morning, and then the weather. Where my fingers are there. Cloudy weather. A time period, late afternoon, winter. See, he's following in suit. So yes, Childe Hassam went over to Paris, saw a lot of paintings, came back to New York, and decided that New York was a valid thing to render in paintings. You got to think about it like this. New York was definitely a highly regarded city, but it wasn't artistically regarded as such. It was just a place. It was a place that cowboys lived. No joke, this is what people in Europe thought. It was like this wild city, and no one really gave any of its artists that much of cred. And Childe Hassam is the representation of this beginning of an American avant-garde. And so instead of rendering the interior space of the artist's studio, instead of rendering a feat of modern medicine in perfect application of oil paints, we have someone making a fairly sloppy rendition or what people would see as, what they would read it as a sloppy rendition of a landscape. But what Hussam was interested in was the exact same thing that the Impressionists were interested in, the way that light reflected off of the atmosphere. They're capturing light. Childe Hassam was following in suit. The next big push in American modernism comes out of Philadelphia. There's a group of 8 artists, actually there's a lot more of them you can see here, but 8 of these people will leave Philadelphia and they will move to New York's Manhattan. They will live primarily in the lower half of the city. And for those of you who don't know what Manhattan looks like, I don't really have a way to indicate what Manhattan looks like. Can you see this? Can I read? Yeah, cool. So this weird shaped thing, which I wish I had. Off the cuff, everybody. Off the cuff. I just need something to hold this up against. That's not going to work. Let me hold it full, whatever. Sorry. Manhattan is this like long, slender island, right? It's less than a mile wide. It's only a few miles down. And so it's a fairly small island. And so basically all of the aristocracy lived up north and all of the migrants lived down south. If you've ever seen that film, The Gangs of New York, there's a really good, it gives you a good understanding of how New York was socially shaped at that time. So these guys move into immigrant neighborhoods because it's cheap. And they live in these rundown buildings above tenement apartments where people are running clothing factories out of their tiny studio apartments. No joke, that happens. There's an awesome institution in Manhattan's lower area called it's actually just called the Tenement Museum, which is a really, really fantastic thing to see if and when you're in New York City. And I recommend all of you come to New York City because it's a cool place and there's something for everybody. So 8 of these guys will move up to New York City from Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, the majority of them worked for newspapers, and they were illustrators. And so the way that it worked is if there was, say, a fire in downtown Philadelphia, the sirens would go off, and these illustrators would then hustle down to where it was happening and make a quick sketch. And then that sketch would be turned into a very quick printing material, very quick little etching, and then that etching would be printed in the newspapers. So they worked for newspapers. It's the exact same thing, the exact same way that we have photojournalists. They were illustrators. So they all had this very practiced hand at quick gestural recording of their world. And in 1902, on the heels of Childe Hassam's delicate, gentle, serene winter landscape, I mean, this winter it's in the moment of the storm. The snow is still white. The streets are quiet. The hustle and bustle of this new urban center is hushed. Robert Henry gives us this. Now, I was hoping to take a photograph of the snow in my neighborhood here because this is what New York snow looks like. It's gross. There's a lot of people that live here, and so the idea of a serene, untouched, snowy landscape exists for about 5 seconds, and then a lot of people will walk down the street, a lot of the snow gets displaced, a lot of it, all of it, turns brown. And so you end up with a reality of New York that looks like this. So arguably, this painting is still like in the storm and the haze of the aesthetic revolutions going on in Europe. It's an artist who really feels connected with Europe. And what you have with this work is an artist who doesn't necessarily feel that connected with Europe, but feels that this kind of a reality, this kind of a real scene, deserves to be rendered in the same fashion. So, going back to French stuff, we have the neoclassical, and then the romantic, and then you get realism, and then you get impressionism. In New York, you get neoclassical, you get romantic, you get impressionism, then you get realism. That's a funky little switcheroo that happens, but because realism never really took a hold the way that it did in Courbet's day, where he was seen as a revolutionary painter, because that didn't happen in the United States, these painters were regarded as revolutionary in New York City. And so this was the quintessential kind of work that was produced by the group of artists who were initially referred to as the Eight, but would later get the name, and it's listed here, the Ashcan School. That term, the Ashcan School, comes from a negative review. Most of these early end of the 19th into the early 20th century artistic terms come from negative reviews that the artists and historians have then just co-opted as labels. So somebody was ragging on the Impressionists, saying that all of their work looked like that one Monet painting. Another review was ragging on Matisse and his crew, saying they were wild beasts, and so historians began to refer to them, and they also refer to themselves as the Fauves, the wild beasts. A negative review of this school of painters, which is what if a school of fish, it's a school of painters. It's a flock of geese. It's a school of painters. A negative review volleyed against these guys was that they had scraped their palette out of the inside of an ash can. And the ash can was a tiny can of ashes that would sit next to a wood-burning stove inside of one of these tenement buildings. And so the implication here was that not only were these artists using this kind of grimy, sooty palette, but that they were actually also poor and living in small apartments that had these wood-burning stoves. So there's not, the term Ashcan School isn't just a mark against their aesthetics, it's actually a mark against who they were and the lives that they led. So that's why a lot of historians will only tell you that they're referred to as the Ashcan School. I think that's kind of condescending. And so I give you both options. The Eight Ashcan School, But if you see a show of one of this school of painters, they're always going to be referred to as the Ashcan School. And there's been several in New England. A lot of these guys would relocate to New England. A lot of their artwork would be purchased by collectors who lived in New York but had vacation homes in Maine. And so a lot of their work actually ended up in Maine and also Detroit for the same reason. Because of what they were painting. George Bellows is another Ashcan School, another Eight. Here we have Beach at Coney Island. So I told you previously that wealthy people would vacation in what is now referred to as Acadia National Park. All of that was at one point owned by wealthy families, and they were convinced by the Rockefellers to donate it to become a national park. Totally sidetracked. But that's the reality of it. That's the reality that I know. I could be getting some of those facts wrong. But basically, rich people bought an island off the coast of Maine. At some point in owning it, they decided to pass it over to the federal government and allow them to turn it into a park. Poor people went to Coney Island. Coney Island is a beach that exists just in the south of Brooklyn. So you have Manhattan, that's like a little slender thing here, and then you have Long Island that kind of sits like this. These two closest counties, This northern one being Queens County, and this southern one being Kings County, which is now what we refer to as Brooklyn. Coney Island exists right down here. Still exists. Little contemporary little contemporary fact, if you've seen the video for Beyonce's XO, I know it's a stupid reference, but if you've seen that video, I'm sure at least all of you have, it's filmed in Coney Island. And it's like it's probably the most contemporary reference I can make to Coney Island, because there's about 1 million different references. It's in everything. It's been in tons of movies. It's been in tons of TV shows. It's been the location of lots and lots and lots of stuff. So, Coney Island. In 1908, the only people that went to Coney Island were either immigrants or impoverished or both. More than likely both. George Bellows gives us this theme, but he renders it in a way that lends these people a little bit of dignity, I think. They're colorful. Bellows definitely did make a lot of dark canvases, but when he would render scenes with families, he would often use this kind of peachy, almost pastel palette. This is technically the same New York, but you can see that this is one side of the 8, or the Ashcan School, and this is another side of them. John Sloan, who's probably my favorite of the Ashcan School, in 1912 gives us the interior of McSorley's bar. McSorley's now has the claim to fame of being one of the oldest bars in Manhattan. It's on 4th Street. It's around the corner from Cooper Union, which is a college that some of you might have heard of. It's where Abe Lincoln gave a very famous speech. Throwing that out there. Not in McSorley's bar, at Cooper Union. But McSorley's bar is still open, and it still looks exactly like this. And I thought about taking a picture of it and putting it in this slide lecture, but then I felt kind of weird showing you the interior of a bar in a college class. So I'm just going to say that it looks exactly the same, and on a good day where it's not super crowded, this is probably exactly what it looks like. I mean, I have seen people that work there that are wearing bow ties. So, but the beer's inexpensive. So if you're in town and you want to see one of New York's oldest bars, go there. Order the cheese plate. It's hilarious. That's all I gotta say. So while the 8 were doing their thing and making these paintings about gritty southern Manhattan, New York situation, there was another group of people that were interested in another kind of art making entirely. They were interested in photography. Photography is something that we haven't really covered that much. It's incredibly important, it's incredibly broad, and on occasion I teach an entirely different course called the History of Photography that covers it in depth. Photography had a long history in the United States. The American Civil War is one of the most widely photographed events in history, in human history. We have so many photographs of that war, specifically in American history. There was this, at this point in 1902, lots of people owned photographs of their families that they had taken by tintypists, which was a specific kind of photographic technique. People knew about photography. That's what I'm getting at. A lot of the American Western landscape had been photographed at this point, reproduced in a very large scale, and put on public view the way that we go to see movies. They would actually go and see these vistas of, Yosemite National Park, even though it wasn't a national park at that point, or just the West, the Grand Canyon. It's kind of like when you go to a science museum and you see the thing telling you about outer space, or even sometimes Grand Canyon. Exactly the same concept. In southern Manhattan, there was a small group of photographers that were interested in equating photography with fine art. Up to that point, photography was about making a record. People photographed their family so that they could have a record of where they came from. People photographed scenes of battle because they wanted a record of what happened there. People photographed the landscape to make a buck. But this small group of artists, photographers, wanted to invent something called art photography. And they did that in two ways. The first was that they established a magazine called Camera Work, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. The second is that they founded a gallery called the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession. Edward Steichen was one of the earliest photographers to join in this mission to create an art photography. And here he is giving you a self-portrait where he is holding a brush and a palette, which are the same things that Bonnard held in his self-portrait that I showed you before, which is from just a few years prior to this. But this is the standard motif of a painter. They want to show their dexterity and their ability, so they make this very fittingly refined portrait of themselves, and then they hold the tools of their trade. And I'll hold my tools. I have a coffee cup and I have a pen. This is pretty much what I use for work forever. Actually, just a little bit there. But this is actually a photograph. So what better way to bring photography up than to actually translate a self-portrait into the code of painting? It's a good idea. It's a really good idea. The other person who was involved with this, and this guy was actually a little bit more of the ringleader. This lecture is not going to be 45 minutes. It's probably going to be about an hour and 15 minutes. But I'm going through a lot of material, and there's only going to be one lecture today. The other lecture I covered already with Kandinsky and that stuff, so don't sweat it. So Alfred Stieglitz, similar to my last name, Stigler, Stiglitz, Stigler, Stiglitz. No relation. Why would there be? This guy was instrumental. He was an American photographer who had spent quite a number of years traveling through specifically Germany, but he also went to France and England, but he spent the majority of his time in Germany when he was abroad. And he was very interested in the way that art was developing, but he was also very interested in photography. And he was the one who decided that there needed to be this fusion of those two ideas. Artists were artists. Whether they were painters or photographers, they were still artists. And so he approached photography the way that someone like Claude Monet approached painting. He was very interested in the record of light. He was very interested in the combination of shapes. And similarly to someone, to a lot of the Impressionists, he was very interested in modern life. And so his photographs, his earliest photographs, like this one, the steerage, is of modern life. So you see these people boarding and unboarding a ship at dock. Now, Stieglitz's conversation with this regarding this work is about how the light reflects off the various surfaces, blah blah blah. Which I said all that stuff. The way a lot of modern people read this, though, is as a historical record. If you told Alfred Stieglitz that this was a great historical record of what it was like to get on a boat in 1907, he would... I don't know if he's the kind of guy that would just punch you, because he would certainly be annoyed, because for him it is actually about the color and not the color because it's a black and white photograph, but the light, and actually the way that colors that existed in this reality, and when he was standing on the other side of his camera, those are all reflecting light differently. So technically it is a little bit about color, but that's confusing because it is a black and white image. Alfred Stieglitz established the little galleries of the Photo Secession in New York City. He also established camera work. And you can see right there in its front page, a photographic quarterly edited and published by Alfred Stieglitz, New York. This is the second issue of camera work that I'm showing you. There's not that many of them. I think he went up to about 20. In the second issue of camera work, Stieglitz reproduced the photographic self-portrait of his newest friend and colleague, Edward Steichen. There were several other photographic images that were reproduced in this book. That was the point of this magazine. It was not just espousing this new fusion of art and photography. It was actually a platform. So where he had a gallery in New York that showed these works to people who could be in New York, he sold this magazine to people that could not be in New York. So this magazine actually sold subscriptions. The subscriptions were fairly expensive for the day, but if I give you the numbers, it's going to be like 15 cents. You know, it sounds insanely cheap, but so he sold these things all over the place. There were actually a few people in Europe that purchased them. There were a lot of important photographers and photo enthusiasts that lived in the United States that were also subscribers. So this thing is incredibly important. Stieglitz was giving rise to the possibility that this conversation could happen outside of New York. That's a very, very important thing, because a lot of artists, they really think that all of their conversations happen in these tiny little bubbles, and they don't allow those conversations to spread outward. And then you have random people like Gauguin, who doesn't necessarily spread the conversation. He's like a little spaceman. It just like bloop, pops off and like ends up in Tahiti, where he appropriates the indigenous culture, but then sends those paintings back to this tiny bubble of Paris where they're sold. So there's no diffusing of the conversation. Stieglitz was annoyed by that. He saw all of these people that were taking that had purchased cameras. All of these people were taking photographs. Kodak was developed in 1880, and so by this point, a lot of people actually did have cameras in their possession. Excuse me. And so he knew that there's all of these people that are dealing with cameras, so all of these people can actually participate in this conversation about raising the bar with photography and making it not just about a record, but actually about an artistic endeavor. He also saw this as a great way of making money. This was a wildly successful publishing venture. The only reason he stopped publishing this was because his ideas around art began to shift. Camera work was a successful platform for the presentation of photo art combo. The little galleries of the Photo Secession was not that successful. Sure, it did bring some young photographers to his attention, but he grew kind of tired of that. And instead he began to focus on the newest thing that was happening, which was vanguard painting, where there was this 26-year, 30-plus-year, 31-year, 29-year. Whoa, my math is horrible today. This 29-year distance between the first Impressionist exhibition in 1871 and the Childe Hassam New York Impressionist painting that I showed you from 1900. That's a massive gap, right? The gap of time between modernist painting developing in Europe and modernist painting developing in the United States was drastically reduced. So after the turn of the century, you see that there's a much easier go-between the United States and Europe. A lot of artists traveled over to Europe for short stints, And when they came back, they weren't bringing an oriental carpet. They weren't bringing a Roman bust of a head. Instead, they were bringing back new painting. They were bringing back copies of Le Figaro, where this crazy person, Marinetti, had published this weird thing called a Futurist Manifesto. They went into the gallery of a German art dealer in Paris, Kahnweiler, Daniel Kahnweiler, and they saw the Cubist works of Picasso and of Georges Braque. They saw earlier works by modern masters like Cézanne, who's changing the way that people were actually looking at the world that they were trying to render in their canvases. They saw the Impressionists. They saw Olympia. They actually saw these things. And they didn't just see them in museums or galleries the way that we see things, but they used their privilege, the same privilege that bought them these very expensive transit passes on these ships from Europe or from the United States to Europe. They used those family connections to gain access into private homes where they would see these things. So this is not as public of a conversation as camera work was. This conversation is still fairly elite. I mean, to this day, this kind of painting makes sense to people that are, like, right off the cuff. It is an elitist thing. I understand that. It's something that I've fought with and reconciled with and fought with and reconciled with as someone who doesn't come from a lot of money. I don't come from institutional connections or anything like that. That's something that I've had to fight with and for, and eventually I came to peace with it, and whatever, it's art, we can all do it. And so people like Arthur Dove had access to the conversations that were happening in Europe. They knew the right people, they had gained entrance into these various situations, like the salon, or the front room, the living room, as it were, of Gertrude Stein and her brother, who were avid collectors of young painters. They bought Matisse very, very early. They supported Picasso very, very early. They were expatriated Americans who were living abroad. And so when Americans would come over to Paris, other well-connected Americans would tell them, "You should go and meet my friend Gertrude. She's rad." And they would go in and they would find works that were of the ilk that I've been talking about for the last 4 weeks. And when they came back to the United States, they would make works like this. Nature symbolized. This was the penchant that was born out of Paul Gauguin with the idea of symbolism, where you can create a pictorial symbol that stands in for what you are actually looking at. And so here we have the general color motif of a natural landscape. We have some greens, we have some yellow, a little bit of blue, and then some shadowy, darker tones that get us nearer to the black side of the spectrum. But the way Dove has arranged these elements is in a way that is wholly unnaturalistic. The sky appears both at the top but also in the center of the frame. And when I say sky, I mean blue. So the blue appears at the very top of the canvas, it appears at the edges of the canvas, and it appears dead center. But it always appears in the very back of the painting. So it's the back. And then you have the yellow. These like yellow, undulating yellow forms, right? And then you've got these green gestures that so the blue, yellow, green, and then the little black bits that kind of dance on the very top. This was an entirely new way of making these works. And a lot of people credit Arthur Dove with creating the first entirely abstract painting. By our account for this course, that honor is bestowed on Vasily Kandinsky, who I do think actually beat Dove to the punch and made works that were near to entirely abstract. However, Kandinsky was a little bit less likely to refer to his works as abstract, as wholly abstract. Dove said those things. So John Marin, who is a guy who has an extensive connection with Maine. He's made lots of paintings about the Maine landscape. Here in 1912, he is rendering the Brooklyn Bridge. So he's not necessarily that interested in abstraction the way that Dove is, where you create symbolic representation. He's more interested in using a different kind of material. And so here you have a watercolor. But this watercolor, a watercolor traditionally was seen as less than a painting. But John Marin would exhibit these kinds of artworks the way that someone like Dove would show his oil paints. Now the thing here that I have kind of neglected to mention because I got talking about how people travel. So Alfred Stieglitz closes the little galleries of the Photo Secession, and then he reopens it in the same building, not in the same spot. He actually moved across the hall. He opens a small space called 291, because that was the address. It was 291. And it was, in this gallery, 291 Gallery is often what's referred to as, but historically it was just 291. He showed this work. I'm not sure if he specifically showed this John Marin painting, but I know that he showed John Marin's work. He definitely showed this work. This is a painting by Marsden Hartley. It is called The Warriors. And Marsden Hartley, like Stieglitz, but when he went abroad, he spent a lot of time in Germany. He actually developed a lot of very deep connections with German families, and up until the breakout of the war, he had quite an extensive access to German culture and German painting traditions, and so a lot of his work comes directly out of German Expressionism. He went to a military display in Germany and rendered this painting. And so what you have here is it's almost similar to the Aikens Gross Clinic, where it's an amphitheater that's marked by these circular lines. But there's also this stage element here. So this is actually a stage. So think of like the Super Bowl, right? When the halftime show happens, it happens right on that stage in the center. But how do you render that? And so Hartley, instead of figuring out a way to render it flatly like that, he just propped it up. And then of course you have these dudes on horses, right? Horses. This is a guy on a horse. It's a funny view because this man is actually facing away from Marsden Hartley, so this is actually the horse's ass. I don't know why I think that's funny. So this painting is going to come up later. This work garnered an interesting response when it was shown in 1914, or actually it was shown I think in 1915 in New York City at 291. It's called Portrait of a German Officer, and aesthetically it's a fairly difficult work. People often don't have an understanding of where to start with this object. How do you start looking at it? What is it? What am I looking at? It looks like a jumble of stuff. The reason why it garnered such negative press right off the bat was because it referenced a German officer, and at that point America, even though it was not actually involved in the skirmish, was definitely not on the German side. And so a lot of families that had connections both in Europe and in America had connections in France and in England, and they were fighting against Germany. And so there was this, people didn't like it because it was showing the enemy. An interesting thing, and a reason why people don't like this work now, or why they think less of this work now, is because it actually showcases a very early representation of a homosexual relationship. The person that Hartley is imaging here is a dear friend, a lover, who died very early on in the skirmish, and Hartley is memorializing him in actually a very old tradition, which is oftentimes what happens when people would die especially in like smaller families or more rural families. You would take the contents of their drawer, buttons that might have fallen off shirts that they never actually put back on, small tokens, maybe small religious icons, small accoutrement of the person's life. And you would actually build an object, or oftentimes just a small shadow box, with these items, so that you could look to them and think about who the actual person was. Like, oh, there's that button that, Nana didn't sew back onto her blouse before she passed away. And it's a way of fondly remembering someone. Hartley did this in painting, and arguably this is as symbolic of a painting as does nature symbolize. Here we have a human symbolized, or humanity, a person's humanity. This is not making any reference to his biological form, other than the structure that Hartley follows. Here you have a round thing indicating the head. We have a line here and a line here, and there's obviously not an actual pictorial line drawn on the canvas, but it's the orientation of all of those icons that are someone's hands that are crossed at the, crossed like this. And when you lay someone to rest, that's how you often put them in their casket, right? And so Hartley is literally looking down at this friend of his who is dead, and he's copying the shape of the body, but instead of rendering a body as a portrait, he gives you all of these symbolic icons. And these symbolic icons are, a German cross here, KV.F are the gentleman's initials. These boards back here are references to time spent with Hartley and this officer playing chess. Here we have other regiment and army information indicating this soldier's rank. This is how we know that he was an officer in the German military. So all of these things build up to give you a very specific view of who this person is, and very, very little indication of what his connection with Hartley was. This was at a time when being a homosexual was, you couldn't be a homosexual and actually be a part of society. People who couldn't hide it or people who couldn't hide it were institutionalized. They were put in crazy loony bins. And so Hartley hid it. And he wrote extensively about how much of a burden that was on him, his life, his family. And so, a lot of people look to this work and want to imbue it with all of this, like they want to read it as though it's a gay painting. And Hartley would make other works that definitely showcased his interests much more, his sexual desires much more than this. This is much earnestly about putting a friend to rest. And so, yes, he and this officer had a variety of different kinds of relationships, but this one I always read much more as friendship and sadness. There's definitely a heavy level of sadness in this work. Max Weber. If he was German, I would have said Weber. This is his Chinese restaurant. In 1915, in today's day and age, there's a Chinese food restaurant in every city, no matter how big or how small. In 1915, there were not. There were only Chinese food restaurants in a handful of cities. And so in a very cubist way, Weber is giving you a very new cuisine, a very new, what is now ubiquitous. We all have been inside Chinese food restaurants, right? But Weber is he's using new aesthetics to also show a new world, which is exactly what the Impressionists were doing. They were using new painting styles to show new train systems. The Cubists were not necessarily doing that. They were interested in new culture, but they weren't it wasn't a one-to-one. Weber fuses those two ideas, and so he takes Cubism, which he's recently seen on a trip to Europe, and he is showing, using Cubist painting styles, he's showing us something very new, which is a Chinese restaurant. So, and you can see here he's not that great at Cubist stuff. He like fractures the canvas the way the Cubists did. He breaks it into these hard angles here and here and here. But he also, one thing he does successfully is he locates everything in the very center of the frame, which is a very Cubist model. But then there's like stuff like this, where it's just like dish, 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 which is futurist, right? In the last lecture, I talked about chronophotography, and specifically Etienne Méry, and that's what that looks like when something moves through space. Yeah, so Max Weber's Chinese restaurants. Georgia O'Keeffe would become Alfred Stieglitz's wife after he divorces his first wife. This was at a time when divorce kind of happened, but kind of didn't happen. But she is also the last artist that is to show in the 291 space. In 1917, she shows works that were made on a southwestern trip, this being one of the things that is from that time period. Again, this is a work I'm not sure if it was actually on display in the gallery, but we do know that this is from the same time period. So my guess is yes, this is one of the most often cited works of a young Georgia O'Keeffe, and so yeah, my guess is that this work was on public view. And it's a train at night, and so she is using abstract motifs. To here, this light symbolizes the train engine. This is obviously the smoke of the train, and in a really interesting play on the idea of nighttime, she gives you this dark sky, but then she leaves all of this very faintly tinted, and she does that because she's interested in making an interesting painting or an interesting watercolor, in the same way that Dove uses symbolism to create this work, right? So, symbolic painting. That's one of the big motifs that comes over from Europe. So, we're almost there, guys. Hang in there. To close, I want to talk about a quick little show that happened in the United States just over 100 years ago. It happened in the 69th Infantry Regiment Armory in New York, and it was a showcasing of painting from Europe and from European and American artists. A lot of the people that we've talked about thus far in this course were part of that list. And you can see down there on this flyer, which is an original flyer from this time period, that we have Ingres, he's a big deal, Delacroix, Edgar Degas, Paul Cézanne, Paul Renoir. I think I just messed up Renoir's first name. Whoops. Claude Monet, Georges-Pierre Seurat, Vincent van Gogh. and as you go down that list, you're going to realize that there's not that many names that you recognize because a lot, just what happens with history. So, this show put on public view crazy art, vanguard art. I condescend it by referring to it as crazy, but it put on view vanguard art. And it was a very well curated show. These artists, the organizers did a very good job of selecting the newest and most cutting edge artwork that they could find. And they put it on public view for a public in New York City that, if the public was actually kind of savvy, they would have seen a lot of these things in contemporary picture galleries that exist in the city. There are works by Paul Cézanne in New York by this time. There are works by, I'm thinking of Rodin whenever I think of Renoir. There are works by Claude Monet in New York at this time. There are American artists in this show that are being displayed at the 291 gallery. Actually, 291 also showed Picasso and Braque. 291 also showed some Fauvis works. 291 also showed Cézanne. 291 showed it all. 291 showed pretty much everything that was at this, or representations of a lot of the artists that were highlighted in this showcase. So, what I'm saying is 291 was this really, really tiny gallery that existed on the fringe, and so not that many people went to it. And so people that went to it, they were having this conversation with Stieglitz and maybe even the artists in the space, and they were kind of getting to know it all. And then this show happened, and the audience got really, really big. A lot of people went to this, and a lot of people hated it. They hated this one, Mademoiselle Pohjani. It's from 1912. It's by a sculptor named Constantine Brancusi, who gets a lot of mention in our textbook, and I'm going to let Gompertz handle that biography and that legacy. But here we have a figure of a woman in this pose, but you can see that Constantine Brancusi is not that interested in giving you a likeness of someone in this pose. Instead, he's giving you an abstraction. In the same way that we get an abstraction here, we get an abstraction here. These people are abstracting things, but they're operating that abstraction, they're basing that abstraction from a natural point. So we can see the figure's eyes, we can see the nose, we can see the hands, we can even, in this image, you can see the back where the hair has been pulled back into a tiny bun, resting low near the nape of the neck. People looked at this thing and said, that's not what people look like. That artist doesn't know what they're doing. That artist has no concept of what a human body looks like. Look at how big those eyes are. Why are those eyes so big? Why are her hands so weird? Where's the rest of her body? Why is it so shiny? Why didn't he give her any hair, like lines of hair? Why is there just this weird little knot? Looks like she has a tail. What is that? Why did he do that? I don't understand why it looks like it's broken. Is it broken? No, I think it's broken. What's that pedestal it's sitting on? Man, that's weird. That guy doesn't know what he's doing. That's what they said. That's probably exactly how they said it, but they probably said it using a lingo that we wouldn't understand. But at the end of the day, that's what people say about contemporary art today. They look at it and they're like, well, I don't know, that guy doesn't know what he's doing. That doesn't look like a horse. It says right there it's supposed to be a horse. That doesn't look like a horse. Sometimes artists make decisions to call things that they don't necessarily look like. In this case, Mademoiselle Pohjani didn't actually look like this. She didn't have enormous eyes. She didn't have only hair that was at this part of her body, like right back here. She wasn't fractured and broken into pieces, Brancusi was highlighting the things that he saw as visually interesting. Chances are this woman had a very lovely head of hair, and that lovely head of hair was tied very elegantly in a nice bun at the back of her head. Chances are she had very beautiful eyes that were big and captivating, and that's why he decided to make them the largest feature of this sculpture. And chances are she had a very delicate disposition and was probably very sweet and understated, and that's why she's in this pose, which is kind of the token pose for a person swooning or a person asleep. Her eyes are open, so she's probably swooning. Right? If you look at it for just a little bit, all of a sudden it starts to make sense. A lot of the reasons why people hate art in general, or don't get art in general, is because it's not because they're not looking at it, because obviously everyone's looking directly at this thing. It's that they're not allowing themselves the ability to just go with it. I'm sure most of you, the first thing you saw when you looked at this was, her eyes look big. Is that a knot of hair on the back of her head? The broken thing is just a sculptural tradition, and that just has to do with the idea of like realist painting, making people aware of painting being a painting and not just this illusion of another world. But so if you looked at this and the first thing you thought was, wow, her eyes are very large, then chances are you're getting exactly the meaning that Constantine Brancusi wanted to convey to you. So good work. Yeah, good work. That's how you read art. You just look at it. And you don't think of all the things that it doesn't look like. You just look at it and think of what it does look like. This one drove them insane. So, Edouard Manet's Olympia caused a huge stir. Because not only was that woman looking directly out at the viewer, but it was so flat that everyone just was so confused. It was like mixing up social cues, and it was also just really not that well painted by the way that people wanted paintings to be painted. And so they just looked at it and they were like, no, man, no, that doesn't, no, get that out of here. Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase was ridiculed by New Yorkers. They hated this thing. They said so many mean things about it. And so many people looked at this and they were like, I don't get it. That's not a nude descending a staircase. That is nothing more than a crazy jumble of lines. That's not a nude descending a staircase. Really? Yes, there are a lot of lines in this work. That's what Duchamp was interested in doing. But he's also very interested in basing this work on the actual thing that he's looking at. You have a head. You have this line here, which indicates someone's chest, not necessarily breasts, because we don't know if this figure is male or female. It's deliberately not sexed. But it's still that line on someone's body. An arm here, hip here, leg, leg. Add all those things together, and you get a person. Right? Now, if you had the opportunity to back this person up or rewind them walking down the staircase, you will see that this head follows this little bobbing line. These hips follow this little bobbing line. These legs follow this little bobbing line. It's painted in a palette that looks like nude. It's nude. Peach. And it's a person. I mean, he even gives you the staircase. Bloop, 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 bloop. Bloop, 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 bloop. Like, I can get why people get confused when it comes to certain aspects of specifically Duchamp's work, as chapter 1 in your text will indicate. And, you know, he's a perplexing guy. But to look at this, it might not make that much sense. But to then read the title and look at it again, if it doesn't make sense to you, I quite honestly don't think you're looking. Which I know is kind of a confrontational thing to say, but I have been in the room with this work with people that have no interest in art. They have no interest in Duchamp, and they'll look at this work. They'll look at the work, be confused. They'll look at the title, then they'll look at it again, and then like one of those. I really hate using this analogy because I'm about to talk about a poster, but in the same way that those magic eye things, where the image kind of supposedly comes out at you, they never worked on me. I don't know if I just don't have the right kind of retinas, but the image would just come to them, and they could all of a sudden see, oh yeah, there is a figure, and they're descending a staircase. And on this picture, and on this whole conversation about the Armory Show, which is what this thing is historically referred to as, I'm going to close our conversation about modernism in the United States. And from this point forward, I'm going to be including little bits of American painting up until the point when the Second World War breaks out and the artistic world shifts over into the United States, specifically into New York City. And it's because of this cultural tradition, Childe Hassam, all the way down to the Armory Show, which isn't actually that long, it's just 13 years, but it's a lot of aesthetic traditions to be shaking up. That's the reason why New York was poised to become the next center for the art world after the calamity of the Second World War devastated Europe.